Hey everyone, Super Spreaders back for a stream. It's been a quiet summer for Super Spreaders, and there's a reason for that. Rain from the channel is getting married this weekend, and it's been a really hectic few months getting everything ready here on the compound, the Super Spreaders compound in the Yukon. But we're ready. Guests are arriving now from all over Canada. It's going to be a hell of a weekend. But I'm popping into action today, quick, to share a video with you guys and some information that's coming out from Venezuela to give us a much more balanced look at what's going on there. Shocker, it's a CIA coup. It's a color revolution. At least that's what people are saying. And this is a reminder to get our sources from more than just the usual suspects. Like, it's hard enough, we all know, to find anything that's center aligned, fact-based these days. It seems like the entire media is one giant complex, and I don't blame you for that, but we've got to go outside of our regular zones and look to get other sources. For instance, let's get the share going here. How do we share? Presentation. There we go. All right. Whew, boy, he looks like a Trotskyite, all right. Just kidding, man. You're all right. So this is, what is this guy's name here? Dan Norman, I believe. I was unaware of him until this morning. Matthew Arrett sent this with the caveat that this is a Trotskyite socialist. So let's keep that in mind. So whenever he says right wing or Trump or anything, it's got a negative connotation when he says it. But let's check out the facts. Let's have a listen.
The U.S. government is backing yet another coup attempt in Venezuela. In the past 2 decades, Washington has sponsored several coup attempts, many of which were violent, trying to overthrow Venezuela's government. The former revolutionary president Hugo Chavez and his successor, Nicolás Maduro. Back in 2002, the US government backed a military coup that briefly overthrew Venezuela's democratically elected left-wing president, Hugo Chavez. This was admitted even by the mainstream British newspaper, The Guardian, which revealed that the Bush administration, George W. Bush, backed this coup in Venezuela. But it only lasted for 2 days, and the people of Venezuela flooded the streets, and they overthrew the coup regime and reinstalled in power Chavez, who continued the Bolivarian revolution that he started.
So yeah, so for me, I remember learning about Chavez, and it seemed like wonderful things were happening in the country, but he was also heavily socialist. And as time went on, the narrative was coming out that he was crazy and a dictator. Now, both of these gentlemen that we see here, Chavez on the right and Maduro on the left, both of them did declare an end to democracy while they were in power, which is not a great look. I guess the question would be, why did they do that? Although both eventually did have elections. Maduro obviously just had an election. And it is claimed that, you know, the fix was in on all this. So let's see.
So this story is not new. There have been so many US-backed coup attempts in Venezuela just in the past few years. On July 28th, Venezuela held presidential elections, and Maduro won those elections again. However, the US and its allies in Latin America have refused to recognize the results. And instead, violent extremists are burning down public institutions and government buildings and hospitals. They're destroying buses and looting offices, trying to overthrow President Maduro. And these extremists have the support of some very powerful people, like the billionaire oligarch Elon Musk, who is now campaigning for Donald Trump for president. And of course, Elon Musk, in addition to being CEO of Tesla, which has received billions of dollars of subsidies from the US government, he also is the owner of Twitter, now known as X.com, And Musk has been sharing loads of disinformation on Twitter, fake news, deceiving people about what's going on in Venezuela. And he is pretty openly calling for overthrowing President Maduro. Now, honestly, this is not very surprising because Elon Musk has a history of supporting US-backed coups in Latin America. In 2019, violent far-right extremists overthrew Bolivia's democratically elected left-wing president, Evo Morales, and the US backed this coup, and so did Elon Musk. And a critic on Twitter called out Elon Musk, and he said, quote, "You know what wasn't in the best interest of the people? The US government organizing a coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia so you could obtain the lithium there. Bolivia has some of the world's largest reserves of lithium, which is needed for electric vehicles made by Tesla, the batteries in electric vehicles, the batteries in phones and cameras and computers. It's very important." And what was Elon Musk's response back in 2020? On Twitter, he said, quote, "We will coup whoever we want. Deal with it."
Okay, yeah, so that's not a good look. Hmm. Musk. He's a ball of trouble, that guy. You think he's cool, but then he's all oligarchical at the same time. I mean, that's shocking to read. We'll coup whoever we want, deal with it. I know he's a bit of a meme lord, but if that's a joke, it's not a good one.
And now, 4 years later, we can see that Musk is being very consistent and supporting yet another coup in Latin America, this time in Venezuela. And the main tactic that extremists in Venezuela are using to try to justify this coup attempt is they're claiming that there was electoral fraud. And I published an investigation, which I will link to in the description below, in which I show in great detail how the allegations of supposed electoral fraud originate with a firm in the US in New Jersey that is very closely linked to the US government and even linked to the CIA. This is a polling firm called Edison Research that works for US government propaganda organs overseen by the US Agency for Global Media, including US government propaganda outlets like Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And these are propaganda organs that were created by the CIA. They were literally founded by the CIA. We know this because the New York Times admitted this back in 1977.
Yeah, there is nothing controversial about this. All these NGOs, National Endowment for Democracy, all these Soros built and started organizations, there's nothing even mildly controversial about the fact that these are fully CIA fronts.
The New York Times described these US propaganda outlets as part of a, quote, worldwide propaganda network built by the CIA. And the US polling firm that is the origin of the Venezuelan opposition's claims of supposed electoral fraud works with these US government propaganda organs that were literally founded by the CIA. So once again, we can see that Washington is playing an important role in supporting this coup attempt in Venezuela and in justifying these baseless accusations of electoral fraud. As I'll show today, there is no evidence of electoral fraud, but this is not stopping billionaire oligarchs who are closely linked to the US government, like Elon Musk, from sharing this discredited disinformation, including Elon Musk personally shared this exit poll done by the CIA-linked, US government-linked firm. So we can see that when Musk threatened, quote, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it," they really mean it. They're trying it again. Today, I'm going to be analyzing the evidence that shows how completely wrong this narrative is. And before I get into great detail, I want to look at a few comments that were made by some of the independent international electoral observers who were on the ground in Venezuela. One of these groups is actually from the US. They're an independent group called the National Lawyers Guild. And as their name suggests, they consist of lawyers coming from the US. And they had a delegation of 5 US lawyers who were on the ground in Venezuela. And they said very clearly, I'm reading from their press release, quote, the delegation observed a transparent, fair voting process with scrupulous attention to legitimacy, access to the polls, and pluralism. They said, despite the soundness of the electoral process, the US-backed opposition, with support from an anti-Maduro Western press, has refused to accept the results, undermining the stability of Venezuela's democracy.
So we just did a space with Wogpog and other glorious guests on Twitter, and so this was, a sticking point for some people. The main narrative is that these are totally corrupt elections, but that only comes from this one CIA group, when in fact the election was heavily audited with this group of lawyers, the EU, a couple other private organizations. Let's see. Voila. So that's the National Lawyers Guild, International Observers Letter, the EU, Carter Center. And only the EU had noticed irregularities, had lots of irregularities that they listed. And only this Edison Foundation claims outright fraud.
And this delegation of lawyers from the US said that they, quote, strongly condemn these attacks on the electoral system, as well as the role of the US in undermining the democratic process. Similar comments were made by another independent international electoral observer, the human rights activist Ajamu Baraka, and he tweeted, quote, I am in Venezuela as an observer and can say with certainty that after systematic interference by anti-democratic forces in the US, the election results represented the sentiments of the people who voted. What is not being reported is the organizing that took place to win. And he talks about how Maduro was able to win the election because he had the support from a progressive social bloc of unions, parties, student groups, women organizations, and they all moved in one common organized direction. And he said, with organization, you can resist moneyed interests, the big oligarchs and corporations that are trying to retake control of Venezuela. We can see this clearly in the response of the right-wing governments in Latin America that are controlled by oligarchs and big corporations and banks. An example of this is Argentina's far-right president, Javier Milei, who's extremely pro-US, extremely pro-Israel. Immediately after coming to office, Milei took a trip to Israel to support Benjamin Netanyahu as he carries out horrific crimes in Gaza.
What is it with right-wing leaders and bad hair or wild hair? Somebody's got to study this.
And Milei is, of course, a close ally.
Case in point, it's two haircuts that could get locked together if they got too close.
Of Donald Trump. They have repeatedly talked in coordinated policy. And Javier Milei is a close friend of Elon Musk, who is joining him in backing this coup attempt in Venezuela. And on Twitter, the Argentine president openly called on the military in Venezuela to overthrow President Maduro. So quite literally, he and other far-right leaders in Latin America, backed by big US corporations and banks, they're calling for a military coup in Venezuela. And I should point out, by the way, that Milei is closely collaborating with the CIA. This is not hidden. He boasts about it. The director of the CIA, William Burns, visited Argentina. He visited the presidential palace, and Milei's chief of staff went to Washington and Virginia, and he also met with the CIA. And in addition to collaborating with the CIA, Milei made an agreement for Israel's spy agency, the Mossad, to train Argentine intelligence officers. So quite literally, the CIA, Israel's Mossad, and the far right in Latin America are all openly collaborating. They're not hiding it. In fact, the current leader of the far right opposition in Venezuela is the extremist Maria Corina Machado. And she, in 2018, published a letter, an open letter on her Twitter account, in which she asked the former right-wing president of Argentina, the multimillionaire Mauricio Macri, and she asked Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's far-right prime minister, for a military intervention in Venezuela to overthrow President Maduro. I mean, they really don't hide it. It's so incredible. You don't have to be an investigative journalist to find some of this stuff. It's on their Twitter account. And this is the extremist, Machado, who the US is currently backing to try to install in power in Venezuela. And there could not be a starker contrast between these far-right Venezuelan extremists like Maria Corina Machado, who love Israel and the US, and on the other hand, the leftist Chavista movement and people like President Nicolas Maduro, who have been huge supporters of Palestine, some of the world's biggest supporters of Palestine. Maduro always speaks in support of Palestine. He broke off diplomatic relations with Israel. And then there, of course, is the...
Whoa, I missed that the first time I watched it. Broke off relations with Israel. Wow.
Geopolitical angle. Because while the US and right-wing governments in Latin America that are run by oligarchs, they have refused to recognize Venezuela's electoral results. However, the left-wing governments in Latin America have recognized Venezuela's electoral results. And in addition, China, Russia, and Iran have come out recognizing Maduro. So once again, as we see with so many conflicts in the world, the US is trying to turn this into a proxy war in this new Cold War. And the US is trying to isolate any countries that have an independent foreign policy and ultimately try to overthrow their government. In another video that I did, which I will link to in the description below, I analyzed why the US government has been so obsessed with trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government for decades now. And I talked about how geopolitics is a big element, because ever since the beginning of the leftist Bolivarian revolution, started by President Hugo Chavez when he came to power in 1999, Venezuela has tried to pursue a multipolar foreign policy, try to build a multipolar world. Venezuela has formed close ties with China and Russia and Iran. Venezuela has built regional institutions to try to integrate Latin America politically and economically through things like the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, and the Bolivarian Alliance, the ALBA. Venezuela tried to challenge the hegemony of the US dollar and help to create a new currency for Latin America to trade so they don't have to use the US dollar. And then, of course, there's the issue of natural resources. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves. And not just that, they were nationalized and they now belong to the people of Venezuela, overseen by a state-owned company, PDVSA. And Hugo Chavez kicked out all of the US oil corporations. So Donald Trump, when he was president, he tried to oversee a coup to overthrow Venezuela's government. And in 2023, he admitted that the US wanted to take over Venezuela and pillage its oil.
Venezuela. How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door.
And furthermore, Donald Trump's neoconservative national security advisor, John Bolton, likewise admitted in an interview on Fox News that the Trump administration was working with US oil corporations that wanted to profit from exploiting Venezuela's oil.
Tell you, I remember my heart collapsing when Trump announced Mike Pompeo, these two assholes. Mike Pompeo and John Bolton were part of his cabinet, I knew it was something horrible was coming. If Trump gets in again, we're going to have to watch what he does with his cabinet again, because I mean, these are the Bush war hawks. How they got past the true MAGA people, I'll never understand.
We're looking at the oil assets. That's the single most important income stream to the government of Venezuela. We're looking at what to do to that. We're in conversation with major American companies now that are either in Venezuela or, in the case of Citgo, here in the United States. It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela.
Of course, you all probably remember the U.S. coup attempt that Donald Trump launched in 2019, in which Washington recognized a little-known right-wing opposition figure, Juan Guaido, as the supposed president of Venezuela, despite the fact that he had never participated in a presidential election.
And if I remember correctly, this Guaido guy actually had a contract with private mercenaries through the CIA to put a hit on Maduro. I might be mistaken on if it's this guy or not, but I think that's what happened.
And the fact that this was a coup attempt is not even hidden. It was Donald Trump's neoconservative national security advisor, John Bolton, who, by the way, was one of the architects of the Iraq War. And he boasted in an interview on CNN that he had experience organizing coups, and he named Venezuela as an example of somewhere he had experience organizing coups.
One doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work.
I do want to ask a follow-up. When we were talking about what is capable, what you need to do to be able to plan a coup, and you cited your expertise having planned coups.
I'm not going to get into the specifics, but
Successful coups?
well, I wrote about Venezuela in the book, and it turned out not to be successful.
Now, that coup attempt obviously failed. Juan Guaido never came even remotely close to power in Caracas. But today, the U.S. is backing basically the same strategy under the Democrats now, under Joe Biden, that Trump did. And instead of Juan Guaido, the U.S. is refusing to recognize Maduro and is backing the far-right extremist Maria Corina Machado, who has repeatedly called on the U.S. and Israel to militarily intervene to overthrow Venezuela's government. And she's doing this in collaboration with a man that people are jokingly calling the Joe Biden of Venezuela. His name is Edmundo Gonzalez. He is a right-wing oligarch. He is not popular at all. And in fact, he barely even speaks. It's obvious that the real force behind him is Machado, who is this far-right extremist who has been backed by the U.S. government for many years. Machado has led opposition organizations and right-wing political parties that have been funded with millions of dollars from the U.S. government. And she's such a close ally of Washington that U.S. President George W. Bush personally invited her to the White House in 2005 for a one-on-one meeting. This is the extremist U.S. puppet that the U.S. is trying to install in power in Venezuela yet again. Now, I want to briefly go through some of the recent history of the many U.S.-backed coup attempts in Venezuela. I mentioned that in 2002, the George Bush administration backed a briefly successful military coup that overthrew democratically elected President Hugo Chavez. After the military physically removed Chavez from power, a right-wing millionaire businessman who was the head of the Chamber of Commerce in Venezuela, named Pedro Carmona, declared himself so-called president, despite the fact that he was not elected. And the U.S. government supported him because this is what Washington wants. They want oligarchs in control of Venezuela who will sell off Venezuela's natural resources to U.S. corporations. They don't care about democracy at all. And the Guardian newspaper revealed that the Bush administration was involved in this coup, and in particular, it named some of the former Ronald Reagan administration officials who oversaw the CIA war on Central America in the 1980s, in particular on the revolutionary Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Some of these war criminals were brought back, including the convicted criminal Elliot Abrams, who was a key figure involved in the Iran-Contra scandal.
Ah, perfect. Yeah, of course. All right, tell you what, everybody, that space from Wogpog, that was way too good. If Wog's still running that space, run over there and check that out. I've got to break off as the first guests to the wedding from Ottawa are arriving. Lifelong friends, so I got to get ready to welcome them and get them settled in. I will do, I'll finish up this video in a part 2, the first chance I get to do a live stream. Might be a while, might be later today. We'll see. Things are going to be all wedding focused here. So thanks for joining. We'll do part 2 soon. In the meantime, let's spread it.